Thanks very much, Andy. A couple of weeks ago, my wife, who's French, and I were taking our two grandchildren on a trip to London. And we were walking across Trafalgar Square, and I pointed out Nelson's column. And my youngest said, well, who's Nelson? I said, well, he's one of our national heroes who won the Battle of Trafalgar. Well, said the young man, what's the Battle of Trafalgar? And I said, well, there was this very dark dictator called Napoleon who was wickedly attacking all his neighbours. And my wife, who recalled is French, interceded and said, what nonsense are you putting in the heads of my grandchildren? Napoleon was this very wise leader who gave the code of law and education to the masses, and the English were a little bit jealous, etc. And our marriage was sort of saved when we reached the steps of the National Gallery at that point. But the reason for the anecdote is that very often history is multidimensional, very complex and multidimensional. And the historians very often just pick a thread of history and make a linear story out of it, generally according to the intended audience. And the same thing is true of GSM. GSM was not a single revolution, and I've identified 8 revolutions that were going on in parallel, either as part of GSM, driving GSM, or GSM helped to drive forward. And since most people who are interested in GSM history tend to be engineers and technologists, it really is revolution number 3 that tends to be focused on as the linear story. And if you look on all the websites, what's the history of GSM, it would be all about the transition from analog to digital technology. And it will begin by the setting up of the GSM Standards Group in 1982. It will leap to 1987 and the famous GSM Memorandum of Understanding, which propelled at high velocity GSM into the market. Will then leap, as you saw on Mike's slide, to the opening of the first GSM networks in 1991. So now you can be part of history because that's the shortest history of GSM in the history of GSM, and that's all I'm going to say about thread 3. And I'm going to go to the very top one, the transition from the common market to the single market, because that was the whole political backdrop to the political aspects of GSM. And the reason I pick on that is that in the next 18 months, we're all going to be putting an X on whether we want to stay in the European Union or leave the European Union. And right at the centre of that debate will be the single market. And those who would have us stay in the European Union will stress the importance of being on the inside of the single market, importance of our trade and prosperity. And those who would have us leave the single market will say, well, what we originally joined was the common market. And that's the sort of relationship that we should be having with our sort of European partners. And I think what's sort of slightly worrying is that I think probably 99.9% of people who put an X on whichever their choice is will not have a clue what the difference is between a single market and a common market. In most people's minds, they're interchangeable terms. And when when our analog technologies started, they started in the era of the common market. And what I want to do is to tell a little anecdotal story, which is true, never been told before, just to illustrate what a hidden barrier to trade is. And the significance of that was that over several decades of the common market, the trade experts were really disappointed by the flows of trade that were going across the European national frontiers against all the theory of what should happen when you have a vast open market, no tariff barriers, free movement of capital. It really was very disappointing the amount of trade that was actually flowing. And when the trade boffins lifted up the drains, they found thousands upon thousands of hidden barriers to trade. And that's what the single market was all about, was the elimination of hidden barriers to trade. So what is a hidden barrier to trade? Well, in 1980, I was a senior official in the Home Office, and my job was to plan and procure the radio communication services for all the police forces and fire brigades that were Home Office sponsored. And in 1980, one of the biggest procurements we had on was buying the little personal phones, for the police. And I think it was about 1980, was the first year that we had to actually put an advertisement in the official journal so that others in the European common market could actually bid. And one of my engineers came in with a worried look on his face and said this little Italian company had come in and asked to be considered, and actually it was quite a nice radio. It met all our requirements. And by this time I was getting really worried, because in 1980 a civil servant was expected to buy British. And you did it for quite common sense reasons. That British companies, they paid their taxes, They employed people who paid their taxes, and those taxes were actually the money we were using to buy the goods and services. So why wouldn't we buy, from local suppliers? So why I was worried was in 1980, all the currency speculators were piling into the pound. The value of the pound was rocketing. So although the British producer, which was Burndet, were very efficient because we crawled all over them to know we were getting value for money, they'd actually become very uncompetitive simply because the pound had rocketed. So what could we do about it to make sure that we were buying from local suppliers? So I said to my engineer, go and find out what were the differences between the burned up product and the Italian product. And the only difference they could find was the length. And since the radios were going into the tunic pockets of the police, the size was an issue. And so I said we must put in the mandatory section what the maximum size of the mobile phone was. Now, if you were to jump to some conclusion that we took up the Burndet with a tape measure and measured it, and they were the figures that went into the spec, you wouldn't have been a million miles away. And when the tenders came in, we were absolutely scrupulous. We had the finance division sitting on our shoulders. We evaluated the tenders very objectively, and the engineer said, I'm very sorry, but this Italian product has failed to meet the mandatory requirements. And legitimately, we threw it out. And I remember him saying that we actually put the measurements in centimetres, and the idiot still couldn't get it right. And that is an example, as pure as it can come, of a hidden barrier to trade. And that was going on right across the European community. Every public official in Germany, France, Italy, all doing the same sort of tricks. And you could see it in the analog cellular market. In Germany, they had the C system. A feature of the C system that Siemens had invented was a means of measuring the distance from the car phone to the base station. And that was used to adjust the power levels. So when Deutsche Bundespost it was then, went out for tender, they said, our equipment had to measure distance in a very specific way. And surprise, surprise, no Italian suppliers, no German suppliers, no French suppliers, because Siemens happened to have the patent on that particular way of measuring distance. The same in France with Radiocom 2000. Matra had all the patents around the particular features. Even on NMT, Ericsson and others would have patents on the particular features, so you would not find French or Italian phones in the Swedish market, for example. So there was an example of all the barriers to trade, a very open common market, everyone could bid, everyone could play, free movement, all of that, but no trade flowing. So the heart of GSM was actually creating a single market in the cellular market. That was what the purpose of the common standard was. And if you understand it from that viewpoint, you can see why GSM had to be digital, because it was none of the above. It was neutral. And actually there were no real technical advantage of going digital at the time we were specifying. In fact, it was a bit of a scramble to make sure it was at least as good as TACS, one of my basic standpoints. And it also explains why between the choice of, within the digital technologies, the narrowband and broadband, all the old tricks were being played again by the French and the Germans. And SCL had invented a very complicated wideband, TDMA, lots of patents wrapped around it. They were the only people who could make, and be allowed to make every single kit. And the French game was to make that the standard so that they could actually, if you like, be the Napoleons of the of the GSM market. And that was unacceptable to the Scandinavians. Even our operators didn't like it because there would be no open procurement. There would only be a single source to have to buy everything from. So the only way there was ever going to be a single market for GSM was to go for the narrowband TDMA because it gave equal market access for all the suppliers to have a crack at the market. But that's not what the French had in mind. And in February 1987, the whole GSM project jutted to a standstill because France played the same little trick that I played with the dimensions, and they'd found features of their wideband and put a note up to their minister to say this was the only technology that could meet the French requirements. And they actually had adopted that wideband. They had legal agreements with the Germans that were pulling the Germans behind it, and Europe just simply, the whole thing was just falling to pieces. And I would calculate by about April or May 1987, GSM was in 4 weeks as an initiative totally disintegrating. It was just simply falling to pieces. I was under domestic pressure, particularly from Vodafone, to release the GSM channels, because they had congestion problems in London, and Cellnet, they wanted the spectrum too to feed the big success. And once we'd lost that spectrum, although they were borrowed, the time when it would have been lost, and everything would have fallen to pieces. France would never have got that wideband because they had about the most pathetic mobile market in Europe. So in terms of size of market, they could not have lifted a technology off. Germans didn't need a new system until 1997, 1998. We would have gone our own way. The Nordics would have gone NMT 900. They would have sold it to the Dutch and to the Spanish. And that would have been the story that would happen. And we were literally within 3 or 4 weeks of that total collapse. And I put our minister up, Geoffrey Patty, to contact the German minister to have a really last effort to pull it together. There was a meeting called together in May in 1987. And about 3 or 4 days before that meeting, I had a message from a French colleague to say that they were going to come along with a compromise. And that sounded sort of quite intriguing. And behind the scenes, there was a very, very great guy, Philippe Glotin, who was head of Alcatel, who had taken over SEL. And he had calculated that 100% of a pathetic market would not be as good as, say, 10% as a fantastic market. So he realized that narrowband TDMA was the only way that was going to create this single market. But unfortunately, he'd spent a ton of money, or SEL, the company had just taken over, had spent a ton of money that would be completely wiped down the drain. So his deal was to try and get a bit of the SEL technology into the GSM spec. So the night before, we had a dinner with the French and German and Italian officials, and the deal was that we would dump a bit of Norwegian technology out of the GSM spec and put in a bit of the French technology around the modulation and coding. And just to give a little bit of background, the Norwegian technology had been trialled in the Paris trials. It had come out absolutely on top of all the performance, all the technical assessments. It was the best technology, and that's why it had gone in the spec. And here in a back room, amongst the single market powers, was a deal being cut. And not only was Norway not at the table, they didn't even know the meeting was going on. And I think if there's a political message about the single market versus the common market, that probably is the message, is that when you're on the inside, you're at the table and you can actually fight for your interests. If you don't know the meetings are going on, then it all gets wrapped up and you're sitting on the outside. And when we came to the meeting next day, the German minister said, well, I've got a wonderful compromise, from the French are going to propose all those in favour. The French put up their hands, all those against, no one put up their hands, motion carried. Over the side of the ship went the Norwegian technology, in came the Alcatel technology. And I was really embarrassed at the next meeting of GSM because that was when, if you like, all the people were sitting at the table, and there was the head of the Norwegian Telecom's Research Institute giving the speech of his life. I mean, he really was. Every point was great, he's absolutely telling points, and everyone had their eyes down because they knew it was all a lost cause. And I saw the Swedish chap walk out with him with their arm around the shoulder, and the chap was never seen again, in GSM. At a personal level, I was really quite sad and gutted with that story. But as my boss said at the time, did anyone have a choice? I mean, that was the thing that was confronting us, and that's, in a sense, a little bit of the politics. Now, if that's a little bit of a sad story, some good came of it, because the German, this is just a restatement of what I've just said. The German minister said to his officials, never ever again are we going to get into that sort of grubby politics in terms of determining the future of our technology. And as I left the meeting in Bonn that evening, a senior French official approached me and said, was I interested in joining a little preparatory group to set up a new standards body called the European Telecom Standards Institute. And that was the second of 3 big European projects I was involved in. And so when we got into that preparatory group, all the lessons of the near failure of GSM were carried into the construction and the foundations of how we put ETSI together. First of all, no single company or country could hold the whole of Europe to ransom. There was going to be weighted majority voting for regulatory standards or individual voting for the industry standards. And that was carried into the construction of ETSI. The second thing was that this wasn't going to be an exclusive club of network operators or exclusive club of any particular subset. Anybody who had an interest, pay your money, sit at the table, and you could actually fight for your ideas. And again, that was taken into the construction of ETSI. Just a little bit different, but we were very, very aware with GSM that we could no longer act as a standards committee, that this GSM was so big, it had to be managed as a large project. So all the tools that we put into GSM for managing large projects to deliver on time, to the quality that was needed, by the deadlines, that was all built into the construction of ETSI. And what I find, really significant is that when ETSI reached its hand out to the North American standards groups, to the Japanese standard groups to produce 3GPP, it was ETSI that formed the competence centre. So all of that culture and know-how was carried into 3GPP. So the net result that we slightly overshot our target of a single European market. In point of fact, as a result of GSM and all the lessons we learned, we actually created a global single market in telecoms technology. And that's what we all enjoy today with our smartphones as a market. And just to sort of loop back on the politics, I don't see whether we stay in or leave the European Union, whether there's ever going back on this. I think that's now sort of structured into the industry structure, but certainly applies if we get into new areas where there are new regulatory policies being put in place. So that's a story that's never been told before. And just, I don't know how to sort of flick this one back. I'm just going to leave that slide up for the discussion period if anyone wants to sort of dip into any of the other stories. But some of them, for example, one that's perhaps just finally worth mentioning is competition, because I think it was mentioned both by Nigel and Mike that the UK was first with competition, but we were really considered oddballs at that time, quirky, eccentric, etc. And the rest of Europe was just watching us. They really thought we were mad, and they looked at the infrastructure competition, the bringing in of Mercury, they looked at the mobile competition, and for both they thought they were mad. When you saw the spectacular performance of Cellnet and Vodafone within 3 years, they suddenly realised we were onto something. And it was GSM that brought in the competition model for all of the rest of Europe. The second operators on the GSM spectrum was actually a feature of GSM. So it's really part of the GSM story, although in the UK, we actually sort of came a little bit ahead of the game. So that's where I'd like to pause.